Okay, good afternoon. Yeah. All right, I'm going to try to do something quite heroic, which is to talk about political economy without being one of them. but really, there are really three reasons why I got interested in political economy of agriculture. One of them is, looking at agriculture in West Africa and more broadly in Africa, one is shocked by how much the sector is below potential. Whichever way you want to define potential, it just seems that there's a lot more that's feasible, and that really it has to do with political, organizational issues, which is not necessarily very deep thought, but it suggests that talking only technically about things is not sufficient. The second is that having lived and worked in Ethiopia and then in Ghana, I'm also very much aware that countries are very different. You would not suggest the same policy recommendations in the two countries. I wouldn't tell Ethiopia to open its capital account. I would work with Ghana to open it better, and I wouldn't tell Ghana to improve its extension services, although that's what we've done in Ethiopia quite successfully. So they're very different. And finally, one could, with that thought, work within each country, navigating the environment. I don't know who used that term recently, Jim Robinson, I guess. Going, with the wind and trying to help improve what works instead of what doesn't work. And that's what one could call the small G intervention, not changing the politics of the place, but creating something that is protected, if you like, from the risks through small improvements in governance. So that's what really is driving my thought. And I want to think with you about whether some models, and we've talked about why tomato could be political in Ghana. We've talked about outgrower schemes in Ghana and perhaps working with chiefs as opposed to governments. When we talked about Ethiopia earlier in the day, it was all about state-led services with small outgrowers. So I want to try to think with you about how those type of approaches fit those political systems better and how we think about it. It's good to start by recognizing, as most of you have today, that agriculture is not such a simple sector after all. You're dealing with very poor and atomistic farmers. They have liquidity constraints, so the credit market is very important and typically does not exist, so it's substituted by other institutions. Output is risky, the price, the weather. So all this deters an efficient use of input, and there's lack of knowledge and education, which constrains the ability to use new technologies. Also, we know, say, from the work of Ricardo Hausmann, that the connection with agribusiness is not that obvious. I mean, in the product space, agribusiness is quite far, and so you need he calls them monkeys, to be able to jump from one to another tree. And these could be firms, and then the question is, can firms operate in particular environments? Also, often the macro has not helped, or the macro is difficult, especially as if in West Africa, we also have natural resources, that mines and oil, that keep exchange rates high and make agriculture less competitive, or that generates instability and also make it more difficult for agriculture. And then we have the land paradox. There's plenty of land around, but many investors find it hard to secure land, because what you don't have is proper property rights in land. What you have is really, especially in West Africa, but in much of Africa, it's a dualistic system where land is much more controlled by communities and traditional authorities and not by the state for historical reasons. I mean, Mahmoud Mamdani calls that the bifurcation of the states. Since colonial times, the states controlled towns much more than the urban areas, and during colonial times, the rural space was dealt with force and army, and not through rule and law. And so that paradox remains and requires special arrangements. I mean, it's not about just it requires deals more than rules. I think some people talked about that earlier. And so one needs to to have deal makers in agriculture, and not just firms that operate as if they are in Western Europe, for example. So of course, as a result, we've got low accumulation and low technological change, but it's interesting to observe that we also have successes. I mean, the failures are reflected in low yields and in low value added, but we've also seen successes in poverty reduction. For example, cocoa in Ghana and cotton in Burkina, just two examples, explain a very large share of poverty reduction, 1/3 to a half. So these are sectors that have been very inefficient, but very broad, so allowing lots of people to go above the poverty line. And we have island of efficient production in horticulture and in other cash crops in many countries. And there are islands, and then the question is, why aren't they replicated? Many of you have asked that earlier. This is a list of examples of successes and failures in different countries. I'll refer to some of those during the talk. You would see there are lots of marketing boards. In Ghana, cocoa remains from the past but has been fixed. In Burkina Faso, cotton. Ethiopia, coffee. You have outgrower schemes. These are contract farming, more recent. I'll explain more pluses and minuses later. You also have plantations, some old public enterprises that were privatized, some large FDI plantations. Liberia is an example of a plantation country. All right, I'll come back to some of these examples. Now clearly, if we want to try to explain what works and what doesn't work, given the weaknesses in agriculture, you need government policies, and that's what we've been talking about today. To deliver public goods, whether it's research or certification or infrastructure, to help complete the market. A good example is the credit market, which tends to be a problem, or when we're talking about tomato, the tomato processor, or transport. So there are market incompleteness issues, and there are innovation issues that also need to be supported. So there are coordination and market failure, but besides needing the state to do positive things, there are also risks of state failure. In particular, I spoke about the macro earlier, and in addition to the exchange rate appreciation due to national resources, also early on in the 60s and 70s, we've had industrialization strategies that have tended to have, again, high exchange rate to tax agriculture for the benefit of industries. Ghana was a good example, where cocoa was really taxed for the benefit of industries, and first liberalization, I think the exchange rate was devalued by 1,000% or so, and that really got the cocoa sector going again in the early 90s. There are also issues of special interest, such as industry, but also we talked about the urban bias, and when food price shocks hit here, the first thing countries tend to do is to close their borders to agricultural exports, so that they imprison the local production for the urban population to reduce the size of the shock. That's one example. But we also have monopolies, fertilizers, seeds, other things, sometimes state companies. And so more broadly, there are risks of predation, whether it's from the state in terms of macro policy, tax, credit, particular institutions such as monopolies, or even communities, because when an important concerns goes to a community, they have to deal with that community and bargain ex post, basically, about the sharing of benefit. Now, in the past, we have seen many models of state involvement, actually. Direct interventions in production, such as SOEs, agricultural banks, the organization of co-ops, marketing boards, but also there was a fashion of state control on the various components of agriculture, very often separately. Different services offered research, extension, credit, marketing support, fertilizer, seed, different organizations offer those things, or tractors. Now, much of this has decayed, unfortunately, in many countries. And the question is why, and I'm not really going to get into this, but there is obviously an element of history here. I mean, moving out of decolonization, early independence, you had very strong industrial push that taxed agriculture. In parallel, all these state institutions to support agriculture, which had the two weaknesses I talked about. State capacity was low. These were state information. And there was also a lot of predation of all sorts, because the political class was also in formation. So one could go deeper into this, but it's possibly not terribly surprising that that initial effort has failed to reach the ambition it has set for itself. And then you have an international shock and the structural adjustment policies that basically destroy much of what was built in the first 20 years. One important question that is often asked when one talks about these periods here is whether structural adjustment could not have fixed some of the institutions of the past rather than destroy them all. Some survived. The Cocoa Marketing Board or the Burkina Board for cotton are examples. There are a few other examples, but much has disappeared. And if there was a bit more financing and more nurturing, maybe some of these early experiences, some of this learned capital could have been fixed and survived. Joe will tell us later what he thinks about that. I want to suggest that the reasons why things have failed in the 60s may have changed a lot, and we're not in the 60s anymore. So we need to rethink what kind of strategies and policies can work today. I mean, given the essential problems of agriculture, a state intervention is likely to be helpful if indeed the states have made enough progress. Now, in the past 20 years, there's been much change in Africa. There's been democratization in the 90s, over 40 countries moved to an electoral system. You have a critical mass of civil society, of private sector that did not exist then, which is affecting the way politics is being played. You have many countries where a dominant party has emerged and that therefore can claim to follow China in being a development state, in being able to be not myopic, to see far, and to be developmentalists. And you have, in other countries that are more competitive, you have had the emergence of swing voters, coalition of voters that care about particular issues that can be influential. Of course, you also have many less civil wars. So it's a different situation. And looking forward, can we expect that the state could be more aggressive in the future? Now, there are many, given that agricultural prices are expected to rise in the future, we see lots of investors running around Africa looking for opportunities. And these are the kind of models, business models, that they seem to be talking about, the states as well. And I want to try to investigate whether those make sense or where is it that they make sense. This is a summary of the new models, either improving old models, such as public services, the Ethiopian style, improving marketing boards by subcontracting some parts to the private sector, attracting FDI into outgrower schemes, and that's really the new fashion, or even in big plantations. The land grab, the millions of hectares that are being sold around Africa now. They're more focused on corridor-led development to deal with the infrastructure problem, concentrate your investment somewhere, various corridors we talk about. And then there's also a movement to support SMEs around value change, investment credit, investment climate, value chain, improving finance, new type of financial instruments. So those are some of the areas that are being promoted. Now I need to get quickly into the two political models I want to put on the table. I will use Ghana and Ethiopia, but really these are caricatural model, and nobody should quote me characterizing either country in a particular way. It's just a useful typology to think of a very authoritarian developmentalist state on the one side of the range, an Ethiopia-like, and a democratic, competitive state, say, I called it messy democracy here, the Ghanaian style. Again, don't repeat it. And I think these are really very different systems. You know, the authoritarian one is less myopic, relies very much on delivery and results for legitimacy rather than votes, but and really focuses on managerial excellence, you know, focuses on improving public sector capacity and services, and is afraid of the emergence of kind of autonomous private sector or powers that can threaten its political hold. That's one kind of regime. The other kind of regime, the more competitive one, is one with much more messy competition, clientelism, but more stable in the long term, and with a legitimacy that derives from elections rather than from results. And so results, in a sense, occur in spite of it, where the private sector is very free, but subject to predation, and to the extent that it can protect itself against predation, it does well. So these are the two models I want to put on the table, and I want to explore how they do relative to the business models in agriculture that we talked about. So basically, the AD, the authoritarian development state, is better at public sector solution. So there are two types of solution that kind of state can deal with. Either stuff developed from the state, such as these public services that Ethiopia offers to small farmers, or strategic deals with large investors that are politically neutral or friendly. You know, Ethiopians here can think of Mr. Alamoudi, for example, as one of those, or some foundations. On the other hand, the democratic competitive regimes are perceived as a threat by large firms, because large firms would be perceived to be siding with one of the parties. So when there is regime change, it's likely that in one or another there is some expropriation. Perhaps some parties would want to attack the other parties by claiming that there was corruption, especially in areas where the government had discretion that industrial policy often afford. But on the other hand, these firms, large or small, to the extent that they can implant themselves around communities of swing voters and with chief, would protect themselves, because then no party could afford to expropriate them for the fear of losing votes. So that's the essential difference. And let me go to my main slide, comparing outgrower schemes, marketing board, plantation, and public services. The first two lines have to do with kind of technical aspect of those contracts. I'll come back to that. And the last two lines with government failures. Now, if we look at the outgrower scheme, this is really a system where the competitive democracies have a big advantage, because it's a private sector. It's my last slide. It's a private sector system. It doesn't require any state capacity. And the risk is predation. But what outgrower scheme allow firms to do is to develop local protection by developing relationships with the community. Now, of course, these are hard to scale up because they have to be geographically located. And actually, they actually have to be local monopolies. Because what an outgrower scheme does really is it replaces a missing credit market. It pre-finances the inputs And therefore, you need this monopoly relationship between the producer and the buyer. And that can only be protected by distance, really. It's not protected by law. So it's hard to replicate. It doesn't work very well in, I think, in autocratic states. We don't talk about outgrower schemes in Ethiopia in particular, because I think these are very difficult to manage politically. I mean, to have hundreds of those bilateral negotiation relations around the country, I think is very threatening politically and very difficult to manage. On the other hand, marketing boards, which are very large outgrower schemes that are run by the state and that have a national monopoly, work better in autocratic states. The coffee example is a good one in Ethiopia. They don't work very well they especially work in autocratic state if the farmers don't have too much political power. Because if they do, then they will ask for a very high price, and you have overreach, and these systems are not sustainable. And that's a risk in autocracies, to be a weak bargainer. On the other hand, in messy democracies, in competitive democracies, they don't work very well because, partly because of the capacity constraint of the state to run them, and partly because these states are too prone to overpay the farmers just to win votes, so they are not sustainable. It is a question mark why the marketing board functions well here in Ghana, the cocoa one, and it's probably because of historical reasons where cocoa farmers have become by themselves an important constituency. And have organized themselves outside of the state, really, to preserve sustainability and pay the right price. Now, very quickly, plantations work better in autocracies because there's less risk of expropriation, but they have to be politically neutral. So it's not anyone that gets in. And public services are offered better also in those autocracies, including, by the way, the infrastructure corridors that I talked about, but it's very challenging for the state to be able to offer these services in an efficient and useful way. Okay, so I want to suggest that therefore, when we talk about agriculture, we need to know in which type of regime we are. We need business models that make sense, and that there is a process of learning from successes and failures and from building the institutions to deliver that are ongoing. And here I provide two examples of Ghana and Ethiopia, where this process has been gathering steam. And I think in both countries we are seeing serious progress, although on very different path from the perspective of business models. So with the rising terms of trade, with a better understanding of the political environment and of the type of business models that can work there, I think that we would have more chances at making these small governance intervention work better. Thank you.